The essential claim that the concord that is made is that Richard will not be king immediately, but as soon as Henry dies, Richard and his heirs will take the throne.
History is always written by the winners. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, he didn't just take his crown, he took his reputation. The Tudors launched one of the most successful smear campaigns in history, turning Richard into a monster. For 5 centuries, everyone believed it. But now the story is falling apart. New discoveries prove that European royalty was treating one of the vanished princes as a living king years after he was supposedly gone. This isn't just a new theory, it's evidence the monarchy tried to erase. Manufacturing a villain. To understand the lie, you first have to understand the official story. It's one of the most famous and tragic tales in English history. It all begins in the spring of 1483. The King of England, Edward IV, a man who was, to put it mildly, larger than life, passed away suddenly. He was just 40 years old. His passing left a massive power vacuum. The crown was supposed to go to his son, Edward V, a bright, promising boy of just 12. But you see, this was the era of the Wars of the Roses. The throne wasn't just inherited, it was taken. The boy king was surrounded by his mother's family, the Woodvilles. And the thing is, nobody liked the Woodvilles. They were seen as greedy, ambitious, and low-born. The old nobility of England couldn't stand them. The most powerful man in the kingdom other than the king was the boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was King Edward IV's younger brother. He was a famous soldier, a loyal commander, and he had been put in charge of the north of England. He had been named Lord Protector in his brother's will, meaning it was his job to protect the young king and run the country until the boy came of age. But as young Edward V was traveling to London for his coronation, Richard made a shocking move. He intercepted the king's entire party. He arrested the boy's Woodville protectors, including his uncle Earl Rivers and his half-brother Richard Grey. He then took the 12-year-old king for his own safety and placed him in the Tower of London. At first, this seemed almost normal. The Tower of London wasn't just a grim prison yet, it was also a royal palace. It was the traditional place for a king to stay before his coronation. A few weeks later, Richard convinced the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, to send her other son, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, into the tower as well, supposedly to keep his brother company and prepare for the big day. But that coronation never happened. What many overlook is the next part. Richard of Gloucester wasn't just a brute, he was a politician. He had a clergyman stand up in public and declare that his late brother, King Edward IV, had been secretly engaged to another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. In the laws of the 15th century, that meant his marriage to the Queen was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, all of their children, including the 2 boys in the tower, were illegitimate. This legal bombshell was called Titulus Regius, the title of the king. Parliament officially passed it into law. With the boys declared illegitimate, they couldn't inherit the throne. So the crown passed to the next man in line, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In July 1483, just a few months after his brother's passing, he was crowned King Richard III. And then, the boys vanished. They were seen playing in the Tower Gardens one day, and then never again. No announcement, no funeral, nothing. Just silence. The rumors started almost immediately. Richard III, the evil uncle, had disposed of his nephews to secure his own crown. It was a story of pure dark ambition. Richard's reign didn't last long. He ruled for only 2 years. His time as king was spent putting down rebellions, including one by his former best friend, the Duke of Buckingham. It all came to a head in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard was defeated by a long-shot contender, a man named Henry Tudor. Now, this is the most important part. Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII, had an incredibly weak claim to the throne. His connection was, to put it mildly, complicated. It came through a line of ancestors who had also been declared illegitimate. He had won the crown by force, not by blood. He needed to be seen as a savior, as the man who came to rescue England from a tyrant. So he launched what might be the most successful public relations campaign in all of history. First, he had Titulus Regius, the law that made the princes illegitimate, repealed and declared abominable. Then he ordered every single copy of it to be found and destroyed. It was made an act of treason to even own a copy. He was literally wiping the legal justification for Richard's reign from the history books. Second, he married the prince's older sister, Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring families of Lancaster and York and securing his own children's claim to the throne. Third, he and his son, Henry VIII, hired official historians to write the definitive story. Men like Polydore Virgil and Sir Thomas More wrote the accounts that we still read today. It was Thomas More, writing decades after the events, who gave us the chilling story of how Richard supposedly hired a knight named Sir James Tyrrell to go into the tower and have the boys suffocated in their beds. The final nail in Richard's coffin came a century later. William Shakespeare, writing for a Tudor queen, Elizabeth I, took all this propaganda and turned it into his masterpiece, Richard III. He painted Richard as a deformed, twisted, evil monster who had plotted from birth to take the crown. The Tudors didn't just report history, they created it. Their entire dynasty, their legitimacy, their very right to rule depended on Richard III being a child-ending villain. And for 500 years, that is exactly what the world believed. That was the truth. Until a historian started digging in a car park. But the Tudors weren't the only ones keeping this secret. Why won't they test the DNA? The story of the princes doesn't just end with the Tudors, it gets a very strange, very important update in the year 1674. The king at the time was Charles II. Workmen were doing a major renovation at the Tower of London, specifically at the White Tower, its oldest and most central keep. As they were demolishing an old staircase that led to the chapel, they made a grim discovery. They found a wooden box, and inside were the jumbled, fragile skeletons of two small children. King Charles II, a king who was obsessed with his own royal lineage and the sacred power of the monarchy, immediately saw a political opportunity. You see, he had just been restored to the throne after a bloody civil war that had seen his own father, Charles I, executed. He needed to remind the people of the ancient, unbroken, and tragic line of kings. He declared, without any real proof, that these were the bones of the two lost princes, Edward and Richard. He ordered them to be given a proper royal burial. The bones were gathered, placed in a marble urn, and solemnly interred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain to this very day. In a brilliant move, Charles solved the 500-year-old mystery, reinforced the official Tudor version of history, and gave a sense of finality to the grim story. Case closed. For over 300 years, that's where the physical story ended. The boys were gone. Their bones were in the abbey. The villain was Richard III. Then fast forward to the 21st century. Enter Philippa Langley. Langley was an amateur historian, a screenwriter who became, to put it mildly, obsessed with the idea that the Tudor story was a complete lie. She was a Ricardian, part of a group of people who believed Richard III was a good and just king, not a monster. She spent years researching his final resting place. After his body was taken from Bosworth Field, it was buried in a simple church in the town of Leicester. But that church had been destroyed centuries ago, and the location was lost. Everyone assumed his body was long gone, probably dug up and thrown in a river. But Langley's research pointed to a very specific spot. She believed the church and Richard's grave lay underneath a modern-day city council car park. Everyone thought she was crazy. She had to fight for funding. She had to convince archaeologists to take her seriously. Finally, in 2012, the dig began. In a spot marked with a painted white R for a reserved parking space, just a few feet under the cold pavement, they found a skeleton. It was a man, buried in a hastily dug grave, and the skeleton had a severe curve in its spine. This was the wow factor. It wasn't a hunchback, as Shakespeare's propaganda had claimed. It was scoliosis, a condition he would have developed as a teenager. He also had terrible battle wounds. Scientists found over a dozen separate injuries, including a massive blow to the back of the skull that likely ended his life. But the most important discovery was what came next. Scientists from the University of Leicester were able to extract DNA from the skeleton's teeth. This wasn't just any DNA, it was mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, which is passed down only from a mother to her children. They traced Richard's family tree, finding 2 living, direct female line descendants of Richard's older sister, Anne of York. They tested their DNA against the skeletons. It was a perfect match. They had found him. Against all odds, Philippa Langley had found the lost King of England under a car park. This discovery was monumental. It proved Langley right. It proved that deep, passionate research could rewrite history. But it also did something else. It gave science the confirmed, verified DNA of King Richard III. And if you have his DNA, you can easily find out if he's related to other people. The logical next step was obvious. Langley and a team of high-profile researchers, historians, and scientists formally petitioned the British monarchy and the Church of England, who manages Westminster Abbey. Their request was simple: allow a small, non-invasive test on the 2 skeletons in that urn. A tiny sample drilled from a tooth or a bone could be tested. First, they could find out if the 2 skeletons are even related to each other. Second, they could run a DNA test against Richard III's mtDNA. This would solve, once and for all, history's greatest cold case. Are the bones in the urn even the prince's? Are they related to Richard? What if the DNA shows they perished after 1485, meaning they were still alive during Henry VII's reign? That would imply Henry Tudor was the real villain. The monarchy and the Church of England's response was a firm and final no. They have refused every single request. Their official reason is that the remains are a sacred burial and are unidentifiable. They claim that disturbing them would set a dangerous precedent, opening the door to requests to test all of the royal tombs. But for critics, this excuse rings hollow. This isn't just any tomb, it is the central piece of physical evidence in a 500-year-old mystery. The thing nobody tells you is that this refusal feels, to many, like a modern-day cover-up. What are they so afraid of finding? By refusing the test, the modern British monarchy is doing exactly what the Tudor monarchy did. They are controlling the narrative. They are, in effect, hiding the truth. Blocked by the crown in her own country, Philippa Langley did something brilliant. She knew that if the princes weren't in that urn, they must have gone somewhere. She turned her research away from England and toward the one place the Tudors couldn't control: the archives of Europe. She went to Europe, and what she found was explosive. The Dead Princes Shopping List. After the incredible success of finding Richard III, Philippa Langley launched her next great quest, the Missing Princes Project. She assembled a network of hundreds of volunteer researchers, historians, and archivists all across the world. Their mission was to comb through the dusty, forgotten records of Europe, looking for any trace of the princes after 1483. The logic was simple. The Tudor propaganda machine had complete control of the story inside England. Henry VII had burned the documents and silenced his critics. But he couldn't control the financial ledgers, the court records, and the private letters in France, Germany, or the Netherlands. Langley was betting that the truth was still out there, just waiting to be found. And she was right. The first major clue came from an archive in Lille, northern France. It was a yellowed, unassuming financial record, a simple receipt from the year 1487. Now remember that date. This is 4 full years after the princes supposedly vanished in the tower. At first glance, the document was boring. It was a request for a payment to be made for long pikes, a type of spear, to arm a group of soldiers. But it was the description of who these weapons were that was staggering. The receipt, written in French, stated the pikes were for the son of King Edward. For Langley, this was the moment that changed everything. The son of King Edward. There was only one person who fit that description: Edward V, the elder of the 2 princes, supposedly long gone. This document suggested he was alive in Europe and raising an army. But who was paying for these weapons? Get this. The order came from the court of Margaret of Burgundy. Margaret was not some random noble. She was one of the most powerful women in Europe, and more importantly, she was the sister of both King Edward IV and King Richard III. She was the prince's aunt, and she hated Henry Tudor with a fiery, all-consuming passion. She spent her entire life and her massive fortune funding every single plot to overthrow him. She was the spider at the center of a web of Yorkist conspiracy. Langley's theory was electric. This receipt was the first tangible proof that Margaret was supporting a living claimant to the English throne, a claimant she herself, his aunt, was calling the son of King Edward. But what was this army for? The date, 1487, connects perfectly to a major event, the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion. The official Tudor history books tell us this rebellion was led by a young boy named Lambert Simnel. He was supposedly a commoner, a baker's son who had been trained to pretend to be a royal. He claimed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, another Yorkist boy who, conveniently, Henry VII had locked up in the Tower of London. But what if that was all just more Tudor propaganda? Langley's team suggests a wild alternative. What if the boy named Lambert Simnel was just a decoy? What if the real leader of that rebellion, the boy Margaret of Burgundy was arming with pikes, was the real King Edward V, fighting to reclaim his throne? The rebellion was a disaster. Henry VII's army met the rebels at the Battle of Stoke Field, which was the last real battle of the Wars of the Roses. The rebels were crushed. Here's the strange part. The Tudors captured the boy, Lambert Simnel, but they didn't execute him. In a move that many see as a brilliant piece of public relations, Henry VII pardoned him. He declared him to be a harmless fake, and to show how unimportant he was, he gave him a job as a servant in the royal kitchens. This sent a message to the world. See? This boy was a nobody, not a real threat. But Langley suggests this was all a cover. The boy who ended up in the kitchens was the decoy. The real Edward V, in her theory, actually perished on the battlefield at Stoke Field, his identity forever hidden. Of course, skeptics and traditional historians are not convinced. They argue the receipt is far too vague. The son of King Edward could have meant one of his illegitimate sons, like Arthur Plantagenet, who was also alive at the time. Or it could have simply been a mistake by a French scribe who didn't really know which Yorkist boy Margaret was backing. He just knew it was a son of the Yorkist line. They say it's interesting, but it's not proof. But for Langley, it was the first solid piece of evidence that the official story was wrong. And it was just the beginning. If the elder prince went to war and perished, what happened to the younger one? The man who fooled Europe? If the story of the elder prince, Edward, is tied to the Lambert-Simnel plot, the story of the younger prince, Richard, Duke of York, is even more dramatic. It's tied to one of the most mysterious figures in history, a man named Perkin Warbeck. Here's the official Tudor story. In the 1490s, about a decade after the princes vanished, a charismatic young man emerged in Ireland. He claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes. He said he had escaped the tower and had been living in hiding. Henry VII's government immediately went on the attack. Their PR machine declared him a fraud, a fake. They said his real name was Perkin Warbeck, and he was just a common boatman's son from Flanders who had been coached by the scheming Margaret of Burgundy to pretend to be the lost prince. This is the story that has been accepted for 500 years. Warbeck was a pretender. But Philippa Langley's Missing Princes Project found a document that turns this entire story on its head. In the archives of Gelderland in the Netherlands, they uncovered a manuscript written in Middle Dutch. This document is, to put it mildly, a bombshell. It claims to be a first-person account written in the voice of Richard, Duke of York himself. In the text, the author describes his life. He tells a chilling story of being secretly removed from the Tower of London. But he wasn't taken by a murderer. He was taken by two men loyal to his uncle, King Richard III. He claims he was given a new identity and smuggled out of England. The account describes his travels across Europe, through France and Portugal, before he finally found refuge and safety with his aunt, Margaret of Burgundy. This manuscript's story and timeline match perfectly with the known movements of Perkin Warbeck. For Langley, this wasn't a fake backstory. This was Perkin Warbeck's real story, because he was the real Richard, Duke of York. But skeptics shot back. They argued this document is just more propaganda. It's not the original, it's a later copy. They claim it was probably a document created by Warbeck's supporters in the 1490s to make his claim more believable. It was a script, not a memoir. But Langley's team kept digging, and what they found next is the real wow factor. It's not about what the prince wrote, it's about how the most powerful men in the world treated him. The team found two more critical documents. The first was in an archive in Austria. It was a court record from Emperor Maximilian I. That's right, the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful men on earth. The record describes a formal meeting between the emperor and the young man claiming to be Richard of England. And it gets specific. The man proved his identity to the emperor by showing him three distinct physical marks on his body. One near his eye, one on his mouth, and one on his thigh, all features he claimed were remembered from his childhood at the English court. This implies a level of personal physical verification. The second document, found in Dresden, Germany, is even more compelling. It's a formal binding contract, dated 1493. On this document, Richard of England promises to pay Duke Albert of Saxony 30,000 florins, a sum worth millions in today's money, in exchange for an army to help him invade England and reclaim his throne. And attached to this contract is a perfect, intricate wax seal of the royal arms of England, along with a confident, clear signature. Richard of England. This is the core of Langley's argument. You have to ask yourself, would the Holy Roman Emperor and a powerful German duke, a man famous for his intelligence, sign binding military contracts worth a fortune with a random boatman's son from Flanders? Would they risk war and massive amounts of money on a fake they hadn't vetted? Langley argues no. They were treating him like a king because they knew he was one. They had met him, they had verified his identity, and they were backing their relative. But traditional historians like Professor David Pilling have a simple and very cynical answer. Yes, they absolutely would. They argue that medieval diplomacy was a brutal and cynical game. Maximilian and Duke Albert didn't care if Perkin Warbeck was real or fake. All they cared about was that he was plausible. Supporting a pretender was a cheap and effective way to terrorize and destabilize their rival, King Henry VII of England. It was politics. The signature and the seal? Anyone with the right resources could forge them. The story of Perkin Warbeck ends in tragedy. He did invade England. His invasion failed. He was captured by Henry VII, and just like with Lambert Simnel, Henry used him for PR. He forced Warbeck to read a public confession, written by the king's men, of course, detailing his real life as a boatman's son. After that, he was publicly executed. For history, this was proof he was a fake. For Langley, this was Henry VII silencing the last real prince, forever. But the most shocking clue wasn't in Europe. It was back in London, hidden in plain sight. The final puzzle piece. For 500 years, if you had to name the one man who actually did the dark deed in the tower, the official story pointed to one person, Sir James Tyrrell. Tyrrell was a loyal knight who had served King Richard III for years. He was one of the few men who had the king's complete trust and, crucially, had access to the Tower of London. The Tudor story, written by Sir Thomas More, is very specific. It claims King Richard, full of anxiety, ordered Tyrrell to go to the tower and handle the prince problem. Tyrrell supposedly went to the prison and, not wanting to do the deed himself, hired two men who then suffocated the small boys with their pillows as they slept. It's a horrible, chilling story, and the Tudors claimed they had proof. They said that in 1502, nearly 2 decades later, Sir James Tyrrell was arrested, and right before he was executed, he gave a full confession to the entire thing. But here is the wow factor that the history books leave out. You have to look at why Tyrrell was executed. He wasn't arrested for what happened to the princes. He was executed for treason against King Henry VII for supporting a different Yorkist plot. And that confession? It was never published. No one in the public ever saw it. No court records of it exist. It was just a rumor, a story said to have been told, which was then conveniently written down by Thomas More years after Tyrrell was gone and couldn't deny it. To put it mildly, it's incredibly shady. For centuries, Tyrrell was the boogeyman, the loyal henchman who followed his monstrous king's evil orders. But the Missing Princes Project, while digging through English records, uncovered a document that flips this entire narrative on its head. The clue was found in the British National Archives by Professor Tim Thornton. It was a will, dated 1516. That's more than 30 years after the princes vanished. The will belonged to a woman named Lady Margaret Capel, and her family had a direct personal connection to the alleged culprit. She was the stepsister of Sir James Tyrrell's wife, Anne. Inside this old, faded will, one line stands out like a neon sign. Lady Capel is writing about her possessions, and she leaves a very special piece of jewelry to her son. The will reads, "I bequeath to my son Sir Giles his father's chain, which was young King Edward V's." Let that sink in. The family of the man who supposedly dispatched the princes was casually passing down the elder prince's personal chain as a family heirloom. So what does this mean? The skeptics argue it's murky. It could have been plunder. Perhaps when Tyrrell went to the tower to do the dark deed, he callously ripped the chain from the boy's neck as a trophy. It's a dark but possible explanation. But Philippa Langley argues for a completely different and staggering interpretation. This wasn't a trophy. It was a keepsake. What if Sir James Tyrrell wasn't the villain? What if he was the protector? Langley proposes a new narrative. What if King Richard III, a loyal man who was genuinely afraid for his nephew's safety in a world full of ambitious Woodvilles and treacherous nobles, gave his most trusted knight, James Tyrrell, a new set of secret orders? Not to end the boys, but to save them. To smuggle them out of the Tower of London, get them across the English Channel, and deliver them to safety with their aunt in Burgundy. The chain might have been given to Tyrrell by the prince as a token of thanks, or by Richard as proof of his mission. In this version, Sir James Tyrrell wasn't a monster. He was a hero, a loyal man who carried out a desperate secret mission. The chain was proof of his personal and living connection to the prince. This single line in a will, combined with all the European discoveries, paints a brand new, coherent picture. This is the survival narrative that Langley's project has uncovered. Let's tie it all together. Here's the story they believe has been hidden for 5 centuries. King Richard III was not a monster. Faced with plots from his late brother's ambitious in-laws, he first used the Tutelus Regius Act to legally protect the boys by removing them from the line of succession. This took the target off their backs. Then he had his most loyal men, like James Tyrrell, smuggle them to Europe. The elder prince, Edward V, was the real leader of the 1487 rebellion, the boy the Tudors called Lambert Simnel. He perished at the Battle of Stoke Field. So, what do you think? Is Richard III innocent? And is the crown still afraid of what that truth might be? Let us know below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.